long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. After my interview with Binyamin Appelbaum, Jay will join me for a conservative perspective. My guest today is Binyamin Appelbaum, who writes about economics and business for the editorial page of the New York Times. From 2010 through 2019, he was a Washington correspondent for the Times, covering economic policy in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. Today, we'll be talking about his recently released book, The Economist Hour. Binyamin Appelbaum, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You know, I thought we'd start with the title. It's kind of an intriguing title, The Economist's Hour. So what exactly was The Economist's Hour?
This book is the story of a revolution that gets underway in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, where economists begin to exert a much greater influence over government policy in the United States and around the rest of the world. These economists are particularly of the school of thought that says that government should pull back from actively managing the economy and allow markets to play a larger role. And for, roughly 4 decades, from, say, the late 60s through the great financial crisis in 2008, this approach to economic policy is really dominant. And that 40-year period is what I refer to as the Economist's Hour.
One of the things that really struck me in the book, I guess it's because for my entire lifetime, we've been in this period, but how in previous times, how economists' opinion were not even considered, and some were very sort of dismissed. And it was really kind of stunning to me to read that.
I begin the book with the story of a young economist in the mid-1950s who worked in the bowels of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and who came to feel that he didn't really have a future at the Fed, which at the time was run by bankers, an Iowa hog farmer, other financial professionals, but no economists. And he came home one night and told his wife, "Listen, I don't think I can make a career at the Federal Reserve." Well, that economist's name was Paul Volcker.
Wow.
And by the end of the 1970s, he was running the Federal Reserve. And today, the Fed is not only substantially run by economists, but it is the world's largest employer of economists.
Wow.
So there really was this transformation where a field that had really been on the margins of policymaking came into the mainstream and indeed to take the dominant position.
Yeah. Now, if people, we have listeners who are both liberal and conservative on the show, and I would imagine that some of the more conservative listeners would first off hear New York Times and then hear the subtitle of the book, which is False Profits, Free Markets, and the Fracture of Society, and think, oh, this is just some anti-market guy. But that would be a mischaracterization, wouldn't it?
On 2 levels. The first is that I think markets are wonderful and important, and we've never found a better system of organizing an economy. But the thing that I think got lost is that markets exist in a context. They need to be regulated in order to operate as well as possible. They need to have rules that are enforced in order to operate as well as possible. And they need to be structured to produce the results that a society wants from its markets. And the second, more historical point is that this is the story of a revolution that had many benefits, but like revolutions often tend to do, it went too far. And so this is, it's a nuanced story. It's not an indictment of what happened. It's primarily an attempt just to narrate what happened so people understand the history. But in examining the consequences, I think it's important to look both at what was beneficial about this period and the respects in which it has caused some damage.
And in a way, it seems to me, you could say that this is something of a counter-revolution against Keynesian economics. And I thought maybe before we got into the nature of this free market counter-revolution, that it might be helpful for some listeners to get a sense of that, what that Keynesian view was of, how they saw the role of government in the economy. Could you sort of briefly sketch that out?
Absolutely. Modern macroeconomics, the discipline of trying to manage the whole economy, begins during the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hits the United States, the federal government literally has no idea how large the American economy is. So they can't quantify the damage. And they hire an economist in the early 1930s, a guy named Kuznets, to try and figure out how large the economy is. And it takes him about 2 years to make the first estimate. And he comes back to Congress and says, well, the economy used to be this large and now it's quite a bit smaller. And he's the guy who invented what we call GDP, gross domestic product, which is still the main system for measuring the size of an economy. So that's an innovation. That's something that didn't exist in the world before that moment. And once you know how large the economy is, you can begin to think about how to manage it and optimize it and try to direct it toward better results. And so you get the most famous advocate for this type of management is a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. And he sets out some rules, which in his judgment are the best way to manage an economy, to limit recessions, to encourage growth over time, to maximize prosperity. And so in the decades after World War II, that approach predominates in the Western world. Keynesianism is the dominant school of thinking about how to manage an economy. And it's basically a very activist approach. The idea is that the economy is a machine and we can fine tune it. We can add fuel when we need to. We can hit the brakes when we need to. We can direct resources in ways that will ultimately increase prosperity. Government has this important role to play as an active force in the economy. And that's the school of thought that prevails really through the 60s and that begins to crumble really at the beginning of the story that I tell in this book.
And to the extent that they're sort of a leading figure in the book, I would say it's the Chicago economist Milton Friedman, who definitely didn't agree with that activist view. In fact, he was probably, I would say, the leading proponent of monetarism. And can you also kind of explain what that monetarist view was?
Friedman's a fascinating character.
Oh, yeah.
So he grows up. He's this sort of short, bulldog-like little guy who dominates any room he enters, an incredibly skilled and forceful debater and advocate for his views. One of his friends liked to say that the best way to argue with Milton was to wait until he left the room, because then you would have an even chance. And Friedman grows up during the Great Depression, but he draws a very different conclusion from it than many others of his generation. He looks at what has happened and he says, everyone else is looking at it and saying government is the solution. The lesson of the Great Depression is that we need a new deal. We need a new approach to government. He looks at it and says government is the problem. What's wrong with the American economy is that the government is overly involved and trying to do too much. And it has the best of intentions, but that's not good enough. And as early as the 1940s, and then more forcefully during the 50s and 60s, Friedman is articulating this wide-ranging critique of government policy in area after area, always on a constant theme. Things would be better if government would step back and do less. And the most famous instance of this is what's called monetarism, which is his argument that in the area of monetary policy, the central bank and its role in managing the amount of money circulating through the economy and regulating the ups and downs of the economy, Friedman says, what we don't even need a central bank. What we should have is a computer that regularly increases the supply of money. Human decision-making is not good. We're operating in darkness in the face of profound uncertainties, and we would do better if we just picked a line and stuck to it. And that is the monetarist critique.
In the Keynesian view, kind of by way of contrast, right, they believe that what we call fiscal policy, taxing and spending decisions that are made, can be an important component of regulating or managing the economy. But that's something that Friedman would very much disagree with, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, in technical terms, their basic disagreement is the following. Friedman maintains that what is going to determine how much financial activity is happening in the economy is basically how much money is in the economy. And the Keynesians say, no, that's not right. You could have a lot of money and it could be sitting in a piggy bank. or you could have a lot of money and it could be spent several times in the same day as it moves from the kid to the candy store owner to his bank to the borrower. There's, what matters is not so much the amount of money, but the velocity, the frequency of use. That's the technical disagreement. And the implication of that disagreement is that Friedman thinks the only thing that matters is how much money the central bank is creating, and the Keynesians think that government can actively, contribute to economic conditions by spending money and increasing the velocity and sort of making sure that money is churning through the economy more quickly. And then at the most abstract level, what they're really arguing about is how you deal with uncertainty. Friedman is saying basically, listen, given the constraints on what we know and what we can do, the best thing to do is just pick a straight line. And the Keynesians are saying, no, let's move situationally through this dark room. Let's try to feel if there's an armchair over here or a table over there and chart a course, step by step, try to manage conditions as we go.
That issue of velocity, that's kind of puzzling to me, because it seems to me almost commonsensical that velocity would matter, just given the example that you give. As long as people don't have their money under a mattress, it's not contributing at all. But is it Friedman's view, do you think, was Friedman's view that, well, if people have their money invested, it's going to be moving around anyway? I mean, I really struggle to understand how he seemed to discount the importance of this. And maybe it's a technical point, but it's just something that bugged me, I guess, a little bit.
So we should begin by saying that he was wrong. We now have very good evidence that velocity matters.
Yeah.
But the premise of what he was arguing was basically that there are regularities in nature at a large scale. Things that appear to us to be random patterns often fall into regular distributions. We think of ourselves as very unpredictable, making decisions on a day-to-day basis, responding to circumstances. Anything could happen, anything does. But the truth is that if you sort of zoom out to 20,000 feet, things can start to look a lot more orderly. And my decision here is offset by your decision over there, and you get empirical regularities over time. And maybe there isn't quite so much chaos as one might believe in the first place. And so I think that's right. And he was right to observe that the extent of these variations was probably being overstated by mid-century proponents, and specifically the extent of the government's ability to productively intervene into the economy is actually circumscribed by a number of other factors. And so, part of what gets lost in the retelling is that the pendulum in this debate had probably swung over too far to the other side, and Friedman was urging it back toward his side, and he went too far in his argument, but there was something to what he was saying. It wasn't crazy.
Yeah.
To think that the variability of velocity was being overstated.
I think a lot of people, when they think about, especially I would say conservatives, when they think about Milton Friedman, they would say the greatest test of his ideas happened in the late 1970s, early 80s, when, as the sort of conventional wisdom has it, that Paul Volcker, who was Fed chairman at the time, broke the back of really debilitating inflation by applying sort of a Friedmanian, solution, cranking up interest rates. And sure, that caused a short recession, but it saved the economy. At least that's the view that I hear more than anything else. What do you think about that view? Is that more or less correct?
By the late 70s, faith in these Keynesian ideas that we've talked about is really breaking down. I tell the story in the book of a woman named Juanita Krebs, who was a professor of economics at Duke University and also the Secretary of Commerce in the Carter administration. And she resigns from the administration because she says that she's lost faith in their ability to manage the economy. In the 70s, you've got this period of stagflation, high inflation and high unemployment at the same time, and these old Keynesian ideas just aren't working. And then she resigns as a professor at Duke University because she says she no longer knows what to teach her students about economics. And that really summarizes the depth of Keynesian despair by the late 70s. Their view of the world had just broken down. It wasn't working. Their predictions weren't coming true. Their policies weren't producing the desired results. And into that void, Milton Friedman, who I think very wisely has observed that the way that you have influence as an intellectual is by preparing alternatives that are ready in the hour of crisis, so that the policymaker goes to the refrigerator and looks inside. They know they need something different. They look, and your option is there, and they take it. And what happens in the late 70s and the early 80s is that it's obvious that the old approach to policy is broken, and policymakers are searching for something new, and they decide to adopt and embrace Friedman's ideas. Under Paul Volcker, who died this month, the Federal Reserve embraces a monetarist approach to policy. They decide to sort of take Friedman's idea of strictly regulating the money supply. They drive the economy into a deep recession, and they succeed in breaking the back of inflation. We really haven't had significant inflation since the early days of Volcker's regime. So what were the economic consequences? This is often told as a triumphalist narrative about the dawn of an era of renewed prosperity. I don't think it's that simple. It is true that they brought inflation under control, but they did so at the expense of tolerating higher unemployment. In the following decades, it was regularly the case that millions of Americans were kept out of work for the sake of maintaining low inflation. They did it at the expense of America's manufacturing base, which shifted overseas in part because these tight money policies made the dollar and American exports significantly more expensive in foreign countries. They did it at the expense of inequality, because these policies also had the effect of shifting wealth, shifting the distribution of wealth, toward the shape that we see today, where we have a small number of very rich people and everyone else more or less stagnating economically. So it worked, but it had a lot of side effects, and I'm not sure that. And so, in aggregate, one wants to be aware of that as well.
Because the traditional view, if I understand it correctly, is that there's always going to be a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, but the monetarists actually argued that, well, not necessarily, or maybe there is something of a trade-off, but as long as we keep that money supply stable, the market will essentially find the most efficient balance between those two things. Is that right?
The Keynesians argued that there was a trade-off and that you could slide up and down the curve, that you could trade off higher inflation for lower unemployment, that if you were willing to tolerate 4% inflation, then you could have 1% unemployment. That this was a menu of options, and the policymaker could just pick from it. And part of Friedman's critique was he said, no, there's a natural level of unemployment, and if you try to push unemployment lower than that, you will get higher inflation. And so you can't just decide that you want to minimize unemployment and expect no consequences. That monetary policy didn't have the power that was being ascribed to it by the Keynesians. And that idea, what's called the Phillips curve, the Friedman's modified Phillips curve, remains influential in monetary policy, although it's under attack now. But the idea that there is some relationship clearly between inflation and unemployment, everyone agrees about that. The exact contours of that relationship are really the heart of the debate that he's having with the Keynesians. And the core point that he's making is, you're ascribing too much power to government. Government doesn't have the ability, and his proof was the 70s, that, here you have this period of very high inflation, and you said if we tolerated high inflation, we would get lower unemployment. Right. And in fact, we've got both high inflation and high unemployment. And the reason is that you're trying too hard. You're causing the economy to overheat, and that is driving unemployment as well as inflation.
So in this environment, we have the Keynesians, who are confused, understandably so, and then we have the monetarists and Friedman. But there's also another school of thought that comes up, the supply-siders. Supply-side thought became very big, especially in the 80s, and it seems to me, I would argue, up until the present. So what is it that supply-siders believe about the economy?
So the supply side school began as yet another response to stagflation, to this set of problems in the 1970s. And what they argued was that you could control inflation most effectively by raising interest rates, by operating a tight monetary policy, much like the monetarists prescribed, and simultaneously cutting taxes. What we really know the supply siders for today is their case for cutting taxes, which was embraced by the Republican Party and became the centerpiece of its approach to fiscal policy. The idea that if you reduce tax rates, particularly for high earners, you will get enormous economic benefits. They will be encouraged to invest, to earn more, to invest more, and that the benefits of that activity will trickle down to the rest of the economy. And this idea really gains influence in the 70s and becomes the centerpiece of Reagan's economic agenda in the 80s.
But for a while, at least, there were plenty of prominent Republicans, including a couple of my all-time favorite Republicans, who were very much against this. Right? I mean, George H.W. Bush, in running against Reagan in 1980, called it voodoo economics, and Bob Dole, who I think, an underappreciated sense of humor, had that joke. Right? The good news is a bus full of supply siders went off a cliff last night. The bad news is that there were 3 empty seats.
Yeah.
I mean, and that just wasn't 2 people. There was a lot of opposition at first. Why was that, and how did they get won over?
This was an attack on orthodoxy. This was an attack on the prevailing orthodoxy of the conservative traditionalist wing of the Republican Party, which had long held that responsible fiscal policy meant keeping deficits under control. And the problem was that by the 70s, from a Republican perspective, this had become a constraint on their ability to cut taxes because they couldn't cut taxes without cutting spending, or else they'd produce larger deficits. And Democrats weren't willing to cut spending, so Republicans weren't willing to cut taxes. And what you get is really a group of polemicists, of very talented polemicists, including a guy named Jude Wanniski, who was an editorial writer at the Wall Street Journal, who begin to advocate for Republicans to turn this equation on its head and to say to Democrats, basically, you guys keep handing out spending increases to the general public. Well, we're going to hand out tax cuts for the general public. We also have a program, an economic program that could be popular. And we're not that worried about deficits anymore, in part because we think that these tax cuts will be so stimulative that their benefits, will fill the government's coffers, in part because we think the downside of deficits is overstated. We can borrow money from other countries. We can borrow money from Japan or Saudi Arabia or Germany, and in that way cover our needs. And so, we've been very restrained about advocating for tax cuts, but now we're going to go for it. And older guard Republicans look at this with horror. They regard these wild men as crazy. They say, you're being irresponsible. This is not actually a viable approach to fiscal policy. But it is enormously politically attractive.
Yeah.
And so a new generation of politicians, including Ronald Reagan, embrace this set of ideas and advocate for it. And it is, as a matter of politics, enormously successful.
And there were also, it seems to me, this group of Republicans who are largely Republicans and conservatives who made the bet that if we keep on cutting taxes enough, we'll eventually get to the point where we'll, in this sort of game of chicken, we'll have to cut spending. And so it's sort of a starve the beast philosophy, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Milton Friedman was actually a very prominent advocate for this idea that, so true supply siders maintained that federal deficits didn't matter. They weren't consequential. But there was a second group of people who signed up for this tax cut crusade who saw it as a road to cutting government spending, that you could essentially force Democrats to acquiesce in spending cuts by constraining federal revenue so dramatically that the imperative to balance the budget would force a reappraisal of federal spending. This, of course, is spectacularly wrong. The political equation has never proved out. It has not succeeded in constraining federal spending. What it has done instead is to dramatically increase federal borrowing.
Yeah. And there's also, I think, a third view here that I hear from a lot of conservatives even today. And you might even call it a moral view. And that people say, well, this is my money, and taxation really for any other purpose than core governmental functions, that's a form of legalized theft. It seems to me that's still a very prominent strain that would support this sort of tax-cutting philosophy.
Yeah, there's no doubt that you hear people saying that. Listen, nobody nobody disagrees on some level with the idea that government is making a claim on private resources and that it ought to justify that claim. And that the question before us is basically, to what extent do we as a society want to allocate our private resources to government for some set of, you know, important functions? The debate is just about A, what should those functions be? And B, in a democracy, if you've agreed to do a certain set of things, are you going to pay for it? And so, I don't think anyone disagrees with that rationale. I've never been sure that it's a particularly consequential rationale because what matters is what we as a society have agreed to pay for.
You also talk a lot about antitrust law in your book. There's a great history of it. I learned quite a lot from that. So could you talk a little bit about the original goals of antitrust law? Because I think that's important because a lot of people don't, I think, understand what the original antitrust folks were aiming at and how that changed over time.
As I set out to write this book, one of the open questions in my mind was the extent to which I would be able to show that the ideas of economists had emerged from the minds of specific thinkers and had traveled, through their pens into policy, that they had been able to convince policymakers that they were the agents of these changes. And what I found as I worked through the research for this book was that the paper trail is remarkably clear. You really can watch ideas marching from the minds of specific thinkers and into policy and into law and into practice. And one of the clearest examples of that trajectory is in the realm of antitrust policy. Antitrust is an American innovation. At the turn of the 20th century, in the late 19th and early 20th century, Americans become increasingly concerned about the rise of large corporations. Other societies took a very different approach to this, embracing large corporations as state champions, as evidence of the strength of their economies. But in America, large corporations came to be seen as dangerous. And beginning with the Sherman Antitrust Act, Congress moves to constrain large corporations, to create laws that are predicated on the assumption that big business is not just bad for the economy, but it's bad for society. It makes it harder to be a small businessman. It's bad for democracy because it distorts the allocation of power. And therefore, we should prevent corporations from becoming too big and too powerful, even if there are economic benefits. So, during the great debate about antitrust law, you get members of Congress standing up on the floor of the House and saying things like, yeah, maybe Standard Oil, which was the great monopoly of that day, maybe Standard Oil is delivering kerosene at lower prices than any competitor. But that's not what we want. What we want is a landscape of diverse businesses. What we want is a strong democracy. We don't just want the lowest prices on kerosene. That's the roots of antitrust. And into the mid-century, into the mid-20th century, that is in practice the way that antitrust is enforced in the United States. What happens is that economists, as they are rising to prominence in the mid-century, economists at the University of Chicago, particularly a man named Aaron Director, who happened to be Milton Friedman's brother-in-law, begin to advocate a different approach to antitrust law. They basically say, listen, this is a nice set of concerns you all have here, but it's impossible to quantify, and therefore in practice enforcement is extremely erratic. Businesses don't know what to expect. We need a simple and clear standard, and that standard should be consumer prices. What we really should mean by antitrust law is that if consumer welfare is being enhanced, then the corporate behavior is fine. And if consumers are being hurt, then the corporate behavior is not fine. And they succeed in convincing the federal judiciary to adopt this standard, to embrace it, because in part it's clear, because in part it has the effect of allowing corporations to do more of what they want to do. And they argue that this will be better for the economy, for consumers and for the broader economy. And so by the 80s, the courts are reliably ruling that businesses can merge and acquire competitors and grow beyond the previous bounds of legality, so long as consumer prices are still falling. And what we have today is a world in which the American economy is more consolidated than it has been in a very long time, perhaps forever. We have 2 major beer makers and 3 cell phone companies and 4 airlines. And I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And for the most part, it turns out that they were right about consumer prices. Consumer prices have, at least to this point in history, fallen during this era of corporate consolidation. But what we've lost track of are the other original concerns of the antitrust movement. Big business clearly is in a better position to suppress the wages of workers. There just aren't as many alternatives. And big business is in a position to suppress innovation because it's harder to start a company. And so the rate of business startups in America has fallen to a very low level. And I think there's very good reason to be concerned about the influence of big business on democracy. So this original set of concerns got replaced by an economist's conception of what antitrust should be. And we're living with the consequences.
And this change it doesn't seem to me, as you described it in the book, wasn't an organic thing. I mean, there was a very impressive, I guess you could call it either educational or indoctrinational effort that was designed to win over the judiciary, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's organic in the sense that, these thinkers arrive at their conclusions, independently. They decide that this is a better approach. And then they, are trying to convince other people of that. And they find that they have, a ready-made set of allies in the business community who are just delighted by the idea that these professors are expressing as like eternal verities the things that they want most in the world. So if you're the chairman of Exxon and this professor shows up and says, listen, I've discovered in my work that it would be really great if Exxon was bigger. You think this is wonderful. And so there's this real confluence of corporate interest and academic interest around this antitrust issue. And listen, I mean, if you could get into people's minds, you could discover how venal they were. I'm not going to pronounce on it, but it is the case that you get. I write in the book about this paper that was published by a pair of UCLA economists in the mid 1970s. It's still often cited as one of the most important economics papers of the 20th century. The basic idea of that paper is that corporations are wonderful. They are, in fact, the best way to organize economic activity in a free society. And you get to the bottom of the first page, and there's a footnote that says, this research was sponsored by the Eli Lilly Corporation. Well, am I going to sit here and tell you that the economists wrote it because Eli Lilly paid them? No. But at the same time, it is the case that these economists and their ideas and the Eli Lilly Corporation and its money found common ground and agreed to work together. And that's clearly a big part of the story. And what you get is a guy named Henry Manny, who was one of Aaron Director's students at the University of Chicago Law School, sets up this seminar, this annual seminar for federal judges, which his first seminars are in Rochester, New York, but then he decides to relocate to Miami, which helps, that encourages attendance. And by the end of the 80s, half of all federal judges have attended Manny's courses. And what happens at Manny's courses is you sit there and prominent economists lecture you on free market ideas. And at the end of the course, you got a copy of Milton Friedman's famous book, Capitalism and Freedom, to take home with you. And there is a very good study showing that you can actually document that after judges take these courses and go back and start ruling again, they rule more in favor of business. They rule more in favor of this set of free market ideas. It transformed American jurisprudence. And it did it both for liberal and conservative judges.
It was really a fascinating story. You also talk about deregulation in the book. And since really the 1970s, we've seen much more of a move toward deregulation. And I think many people who cite the benefits of deregulation would point first and foremost to the airline industry, because it seems to me to be a lot of folks to be a very clear case of, government got out of the way. We got more flights, we got lower prices, reduced air cargo costs. It was an unqualified success, and this is why we need to do deregulation. Would you say that's a fair conclusion?
So I think it's important to draw a distinction between two kinds of regulation. During the mid-century, the Keynesian era, if you will, the government was very involved in a kind of regulation that has disappeared so much today that it's worth just reminding people of how pervasive it was. This was what's called economic regulation, or the regulation of prices and quantities. The government literally dictated across large swaths of the economy how much money you could charge to ship products from Cincinnati to Cleveland. Well, not from Cincinnati to Cleveland, but from Cincinnati to Louisville, across state lines. If you wanted to move goods by truck or by train or by airplane, the government would tell you, if you could do that and how much you could charge. Telecommunications was highly regulated. Air travel, the government thought nothing of telling steelmakers how much to charge for steel. Thought nothing of setting up price boards to determine the price of frozen chicken. There was this pervasive sense that the government had a role to play in managing prices. And that's the type of regulation that economists really systematically dismantle. The airline industry is the first and perhaps the most famous example. In the late 1970s, under the Carter administration, an economist named Alfred Kahn, who is quite a character in his own right, is tasked by Carter with liberating the airline industry from this type of regulation. The reason I'm saying that there's a distinction is during this same period, you see the rise of modern health and safety and environmental regulation. So the aggregate number of regulators employed by the federal government actually increases during these years. But there's this dramatic shift where, at the outset of the 70s, 80 or 90% of them are employed in economic regulation. And by the end of the decade, it's reversed. And you now have this new kind of regulation. So with regard to economic regulation and the deregulation of the airlines, for example, this is where we get to the idea of a revolution that went too far. There's no question that deregulation democratized air travel. Americans today fly 8 times more often than Americans did a half a century ago. Flights are cheaper. They're safer than they've ever been. Air travel is widely available, and if everyone's miserable, well, that's a choice we've made. We're not willing to pay more than the amount required to transport us in misery. So that's air travel, and it's great. The problem that emerges is that the government has so completely removed itself from the marketplace, has placed so much faith in free market competition, that the airline industry rapidly consolidates, and you end up with 4 big carriers. And anybody who's been online to search for a ticket to go home for Christmas knows that, the prices are all the same. And there's a reason for that, which is that there's no competition anymore. And that's the result of a failure to regulate the marketplace. The antitrust rules that we were talking about a moment ago, the idea that the government ought to make sure that you don't end up with just a few large companies dominating air travel, for example, that enforcement regime collapses, and the result is that we're all going to suffer from an absence of competition.
Now, that was something that, let me see if I get the Economist right, that I think George Stigler said would be impossible. Wasn't he the economist who said that it's not cartels that kill markets, but markets that kill cartels? Is that right?
Yeah, it's a great story. So this is a great example of the triumph of theory over the real world. So Stigler is one of the early proponents of economic deregulation, and he argues really with great force and fervor and a fair amount of flair that everyone is misunderstanding. Everyone is so concerned that businesses are going to collude with each other. Adam Smith, sort of the founder of economics, had famously said that, any gathering of businessmen is almost inherently going to devolve into a conspiracy to fix prices. And Stigler mocked this idea. He said, no, that's wrong. It's really hard to have a cartel. It's really hard to maintain cooperation. Companies will try to take advantage of each other. They'll try to cheat. The thing will fall apart, and consumers will be the ultimate beneficiaries. Well, you had 2 predictions there. You had Adam Smith's prediction and you had George Stigler's prediction. And George Stigler's prediction was used as the basis for rewriting federal policy to essentially, eliminate collusion as a concern. And then in the 1990s, the Justice Department, aware that collusion might sometimes happen, makes this very interesting change in policy. They tell companies, listen, if you happen to be part of a cartel, they're trying to take advantage of Stigler's logic, which is that companies are looking for any opportunity to put one over on their competitors. Right. They say, if you happen to be part of a cartel and you are the first company to tell us about the cartel, you get off scot-free, everyone else gets punished. So what happens? Yeah. They're not expecting much to happen. They don't think there are very many cartels. There is an absolute flood. Companies are coming, piling up, racing each other to get to the Justice Department. And these are just the cartels that are falling apart. And it turns out that cartel activity in the American economy is pervasive. all sorts of industries are massively colluding against the interests of consumers all the time, often on a very sustained basis. So, I mean, this is one of these great tests of Stigler's theory, and it turns out that he could not have been more wrong.
Yeah. You mentioned previously that while we don't do economic regulation that much at all anymore in the United States, we do actually do quite a lot of health and safety regulation. And in doing that, what's inevitable is that we have to weigh the cost of a human life. And in your telling of this story, what struck me maybe more than anything else was how that number bounced back and forth from administration to administration, where it seems like there was, I won't say there was no objective measure, but wow, there was a lot of subjectivity between how Republican and Democratic administrations valued human life for these calculations.
Yeah, so one of the great contributions of economics to public policy is the rise of what's called cost-benefit analysis, which basically just means that in making policy, the government is trying to systematically assess and weigh the costs and benefits, to quantify costs and benefits so that it can make a comparison and reach a determination about whether a policy is worthwhile. So, for example, if you are considering requiring automakers to put stronger roofs on cars, you want to calculate how much that's going to cost, which is fairly straightforward. And then you want to think about, well, what are the benefits of stronger car roofs? You might say, we know there's a certain number of rollover crashes each year. This is how many people were killed last year. This is how many people were injured last year. And then you reach a very important question, which is, how do you put a dollar figure on that? How do you compare that to the cost of actually installing stronger car roofs? Even if you know how many lives you'll save, how much is that worth? And so in the 1970s, economists, and it's an amazing story, begin to evolve a methodology for assigning a value to human life. We can talk about how they do that, but for the moment, let's just stipulate that they do it. And that number is currently about $10 million a year. And once you know how much life is worth, it becomes easier to assess proposed changes in regulation and determine whether or not they're worthwhile. So there's a very scientific approach here. In theory, it's scientific sounding, careful, fancy calculations. But one of the profound truths about this methodology, which you just described, is that during Republican administrations, the government finds reasons to reduce the value of human life. It argues, for example, that old people are worth less money. It argues that you shouldn't adjust for inflation. And conversely, during Democratic administrations, the government finds reasons to increase the value of human life, such as arguing that children are more valuable, or that some types of deaths are particularly painful and therefore we should pay more to avoid, say, cancer. This is fascinating to me because what it really illustrates is the extent to which economics is ultimately political.
Yeah.
These are methodologies that can discipline our thinking. They can force us to assess costs and benefits, but it's really important to recognize that it's not science in the sense of physics. It is ultimately the assumptions that you make ultimately dictate the conclusions that you reach. And the pretense that this is a purely analytical process is nonsensical. We are, in fact, we're using this system to discipline our thinking. But when we pretend that the conclusions are inviolable and absolute, then we're into the land of make-believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just did a great job of illustrating that. I think that false certainty sometimes that people have when they see, the hard data, and the squishiness behind that was just made so evident in how you told that story. I also want to talk a little bit about international economics, which you cover in the book as well. And Milton Friedman and the Chicago School economists believed that floating exchange rates would give us balanced trade and stability through the workings of the market. And from the end of World War II up until the 1970s, we had, well, maybe not entirely fixed, but at least a mostly fixed exchange rate system. And so could you talk a little bit about why that ended, and even more importantly, if Friedman and that group was right about the superiority of floating exchange rates?
So one of the first big breakthroughs in policy that Milton Friedman achieves is in the realm of exchange rates. After the second, or really in the dying days of the Second World War, the United States and its allies agree to create a new monetary system called the Bretton Woods system, under which the values of other foreign currencies are fixed to the dollar at specified rates. So when you get off an airplane in the airport, there's no foreign exchange board there telling you how much the pound is worth, because the pound is worth exactly as much as it was yesterday, and it'll be worth the same amount tomorrow. And the idea is that this facilitates trade. It provides a degree of certainty that allows businesses to invest with confidence and people to transact across borders with confidence that currencies will remain in fixed relationships. So it sounds on the surface like a really good system, but by the late 60s and early 1970s, it was breaking down because those relationships ultimately need to be consistent with the strength of the economies that they represent. So what you had in that period was that the Japanese and German economies were growing much faster than the American economy, while the exchange rates between the dollar and the Deutschmark and the yen were remaining in place. And the effect was that in essence, we were allowing German and Japanese products to be sold at a discount in the United States because the relative value of those currencies was being changed by the faster growth of those economies. This was great for German and Japanese exporters. It was great for American consumers, but it was terrible for American companies that wanted A, to be selling to Americans, and B, to be selling to the Germans and the Japanese. And the underlying problem was just that the fixed rates, a system of fixed rates that doesn't adjust to economic conditions, ultimately becomes, it preserves distortions. It starts to crack under the pressure. And in the early 1970s, Milton Friedman plays a key role in convincing the Nixon administration to end the Bretton Woods Agreement, to blow it up. Nixon famously goes on TV on a Sunday night and announces, this was talked about at the time as a kind of gold standard, which it wasn't really, but be that as it may. Yeah. And he announces that the United States is ending this agreement and moving, and over the next couple of years, it moves to a system of floating exchange rates, where the value of any currency in terms of another currency is just determined by what other people are willing to pay for it. And so it's fixed by the market. And now when you get off an airplane, you do need to consult the digital board to find out how much your money is worth. And that is a system that Milton Friedman had long advocated for as superior in terms of two things. First, he said it would increase global trade. It would facilitate trade. Stability was actually less important than accuracy. And on that dimension, he really appears to have been right. Global trade has expanded massively since the advent of floating exchange rates. And he also argued that it would be much better for economic stability, that exchange rates would reflect underlying market conditions and there would be fewer adjustments, and this would allow economies to maintain their balance. And in that respect, he's been entirely wrong. The world of floating exchange rates is every bit as volatile as the world of fixed rates, maybe even more so. Financial crises have been a recurring phenomenon. In particular, global capital flows have been very disruptive as money sloshes from one country to another. And so, this new world has come with its own problems. But, it's a great example of sometimes people look at, this era that we've lived through, this free market era, and they say, well, let's just go back to the system we had before. Well, you can't quite do that. The system that we had before was broken. The Bretton Woods Agreement was no longer working, and it can't be revived. Yeah. And so some of what we need to confront is that was broken, and this new thing that we've tried has problems too. And so we can't go back to the old thing. What we need is a new thing. What we need is to once again address the problems with our present reality.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because you also bring that in when you talk about financial markets in the book. And you write, there's little foundation for the nostalgic narrative that policymakers could have prevented the modern era of financial crises by maintaining the mid-century system of banking regulations. And I read that and I thought, wow, I'm pretty sure that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders would definitely not agree with that, because, of course, both of them have called for reinstating the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act. So why? What's your disagreement with them on this? Why do you think that bringing that back would not have prevented the problem, and presumably would not be a good thing for 2019, 2020?
Yeah, there's a couple of issues there. The Glass-Steagall Act was written for a very different world. It was written for a world in which the United States was essentially a closed market. There were not foreign financial institutions actively serving American businesses. You could not easily invest in the financial markets in another country. That world just has shattered beyond, we can't return to a world in which the American investor, has only the choice of, whatever that bank is called, and It's a Wonderful Life. Like, I can right now, while we're talking, invest in a Japanese company or move my money to Germany or, borrow from a Brazilian bank. The idea that the United States can control financial markets on its own terms, it's a myth, it's a dream. We live in a very different world today. And the Glass-Steagall Act was specifically designed to preserve a distinction that had almost entirely ceased to exist in practice by the time that the act was actually repealed in the late 90s. So the Glass-Steagall Act is a Depression-era creation that basically said that banks needed to be either in the sort of the traditional banking business of collecting deposits and making loans, or in the Wall Street business of raising money for companies and investing in companies. You couldn't do both of those things at the same time. But by the late 90s, companies had learned to do both of those things at the same time. They just didn't have quite the full measure of legal permission that the repeal of the act finally granted them. So I just don't think that act addresses any of our present problems. I think it has name brand appeal, and so politicians keep on talking about it, but they literally don't know what they're talking about when they're advocating for it. They're literally advocating for a law that would be completely meaningless in the modern context. And in fairness, because you mentioned them, in fairness to Senator Warren in particular, she's a very sophisticated appraiser of financial markets. She understands this. Her approach to regulation rests substantially on much more sophisticated and modern measures to regulate the financial industry as it actually operates in the modern era, in the present day. Her advocacy for Glass-Steagall I would classify as sort of, an exercise in nostalgia and sort of name brand association. But I don't think it's at the core of her approach to financial regulation.
Right. Alan Greenspan, for the end part of the Economist Hour period, was sort of held up as this exemplar, right, of this view. And when he testified before Congress in 2008, he expressed shocked disbelief that markets didn't regulate for the self-interests of, of the interests of shareholders' equity. But in the book, you point out that what's shocking really is the fact that Alan Greenspan was so shocked, because there were a number of points in the past where he expressed the same shocked disbelief that markets didn't do what he expected them to do, right?
So I want to briefly defend Alan Greenspan on one level before I make a broader critique. So Greenspan is sometimes I think frequently misunderstood in terms of what he was saying. Greenspan understood that markets were imperfect. He understood that there would be crises. The point that he maintained throughout his life, still maintains, is that it is his view that the downside of markets is smaller than the downside of regulation. That the failures of markets, which are real and will happen, will nonetheless be smaller and less consequential than the failures of a regulatory regime.
Got it.
Government will make, this is this old Friedman dictum that government will make matters worse. So it's not an absolute claim, it's a comparative claim. And there is a distinction there that I think is meaningful. But that said, I don't think we've fully grappled. I don't think Alan Greenspan has yet, been assigned the blame that he deserves for his enormous mismanagement of the American financial sector and the American economy during a long period as the most influential policymaker in Washington. This is a man who literally says that he was appointed to be the nation's chief financial regulator, and he says that when he took that oath, he didn't mean it. And not only did he not intend to regulate the financial sector, but he actively prevented other people from regulating the financial sector. And in this judgment, he was spectacularly misguided. And so, if there was anyone in position to produce a better set of outcomes over the last 40 years, it probably was Alan Greenspan, who, had he been had he been at all interested in doing his job, had he been at all conscientious about enforcing the laws of the United States, had he, you would have been in a very different place now. And so I think, he really embodies the extent to which economists gained influence over the levers of power, came to be not just the advisors to policymakers, but to serve themselves in critical policymaking roles. And the confidence that they had that they understood the world deeply informed the way that they operated in those roles. And the consequences were really dramatically bad.
Yeah. One final question for you. Your premise is that the Economist hours ended, and I wonder about that because while I see a lot more what you might call a counter revolutionary progressive thought on this, I haven't seen any of that translate into policy. When I look at what actually happens, it seems to me that that kind of small government supply side thinking is really just about as strong as ever and is still the dominant paradigm. So am I just being too pessimistic, or am I missing something, or has the Economist hour well and truly ended, do you think?
I do think that something really important happened in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, that there was a loss, that if you go back before the crisis, there was this consensus that we understood how the economy worked, and that in key respects, you really had the mainstream of economics was remarkably homogenous in its view of how economies work and what optimal policies are. And 2008 shattered that consensus. And so economics is in the throes of huge debates about foundational issues for the first time in a couple of generations. And policymaking is also in a state of turmoil. Much like the 1930s and the 1970s, we're in a period now where it is clear that what we were doing stopped working and not yet clear what we should do instead. And one needs to look no further than the presidency of Donald Trump. The current president has less regard for economists and experts than any of his modern predecessors. He has, upended, a very long-standing consensus about America's approach to trade. He has very little interest in the use of cost-benefit analysis. He, has a disdain for methods of economic thinking and the weighing of costs and benefits, or sort of systematic decision-making in general. He embodies one response to the breakdown of the technocracy, which is basically, I think of it as turtle shell nationalism, sort of pull back into your shell and hope the rest of the world goes away. There are others. We'll see which ones emerge over time. But I don't think there's any question. And it doesn't mean that the results are better. Like that I think is one misconception. Like the end of the Economist hour doesn't mean that the bad things about the Economist hour go away and life is better as a consequence. It literally means that a paradigm has broken down and that we're operating at the moment without a clear paradigm. And there's some chaotic consequences to that.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting time. And it was also an incredibly interesting book. I would say for people who, even if they think they don't like economics, just for the stories and the people, it's worth reading. It's a great book, and I'm so glad you read it. I'm thankful you had the time to talk with me about it today.
Well, I was really glad to join you. Thank you.
So, Jay, what'd you think?
Actually, I tell you, I loved it.
Cool.
I think he reminded me of like professors I'd had in law school who I'd really liked. I think and maybe that's part of just the delivery. But no, he came across as I shouldn't say came across as, but I don't disagree with most all of what he's saying. I mean, the kind of what he was saying, he wasn't so much making partisan political points or arguments. It was more just here's the analysis of what's happened and where we were and where we are. And I think it's fantastically helpful, and it was even kind of fun. And maybe it's because I'm sort of geeky, but to do sort of the refresher course on economics in general.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Because so often we talk about these things and we sort of use shorthand for what, here's what supply side is, here's what monetarism is. But to sort of get sort of the backdrop of where that comes from, and the historical context.
Yeah,
I found out I'm not necessarily the supply sider that I thought I was. I'm sort of these sort of modified supply siders, I guess.
Well, and I think that's a great point. And the thing that I think a lot of people who don't have more of an historical sense maybe sometimes fail to appreciate is how cyclical we see these things are, right? Kind of reactions and counter reactions, and they both tend to go a little bit too far, then they're pulled back to the center. And that's one of the things I love about our system in a broader, perspective, is that over time, these swings of the pendulum tend to sort of, work themselves out in a way. And that to me is the genius of our system. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but that's, I think, a really great quality. But you have to understand that that's why we get these things, these strong reactions to, the first the Keynesians strongly reacting to the laissez-faire, and then the monetarists and the supply side are strongly reacting to the Keynesianism. And if you just look at that one moment in time, you say, what's wrong with these people? Why are they so crazy? Why are they so extreme? But then if you kind of pull back and look at the larger history, like, well, okay, it's because of this. And that perspective, I think, is great.
Yeah. The areas where I don't want to say disagreed, because I don't think that's necessarily fair. And also, you read the book, I didn't read the book. So I don't want to take shots about, well, you should have, addressed this, and it may well be in the book. But the discussion of antitrust law and regulation, I think there's a piece that's left out, and that is, he made the point of antitrust law became sort of this. These aren't his words, but I'll use my words, sort of infected, enlightened perhaps by conservative free market thinking. And I would differ a little bit in that, to some extent, when these laws were created, there weren't metrics to be able to determine exactly, okay, when are they being violated, right? You had the big trusts, like, okay, that's easy to see. Well, you say, well, okay, we'll bust up Standard Oil. But other things, what it comes along, when there are other accommodations, are there ones that are economically good? And then there's, so then you get in this whole type of economic analysis, just because you necessarily, a court's going to say, well, how can I tell? Someone give me a metric, a measuring stick, give me some kind of evidence to show. And the most typical evidence in antitrust cases is, of market dominance, is you have the ability to control price. And so that's, I think it's less of a this was something that folks, free marketers, thought up to, confuse the courts or change the law, and more just, look, there needed to be some sort of metric to do this. And antitrust law is a weird animal in that, unlike so many other cases, it is sort of like dueling economists, right? It's not what are the facts, what happened. It's sort of, what conclusions can we draw from this economic analysis? And then the other side is another economist and says, oh no, this does affect price and ability to compete and so forth. I see what you're saying. I think it's a great point. Then on the other hand, I feel like there are these important things that are just really difficult to quantify. And while I think that it's important to have some sort of a standard. Oftentimes, I feel like we tend to discount things that we can't quantify, as opposed to saying, well, this is important and we're going to try to weigh it, but understand that we can't quantify it. Things like, he mentioned the too much political power. Well, what does that mean? Well, I think a lot of people would say, I get that's important. Or the idea of maybe if we have a monopoly, there's going to be less innovation. And we can't really measure that, but we get the sense that that makes common sense to us. But how do we put that into our determination of whether or not we should break up this company? Right, exactly. And that's kind of my point, is because how do you present that to the judge? Yeah. Or the jury, and say, look, it's too much. Well, because they gave these many contributions. Well, I don't know, but did that really? That's the problem. There's just, if you're going to court to seek some sort of because part of what courts do is, in saying one thing is okay or not okay, they draw a line and say, okay, if you're on this side of the line, then it is okay. And businesses particularly need that sort of metric. I would say most businesses don't want to break the law. They want to know, what is it that we can do legally, and they'll look at where those lines are. And the more confused those lines are,
Yeah.
the more uncertainty, the worse it is, I think, for all involved. Because you can't have that reliance on, hey, this looks like a great idea, let's move forward. Even in some cases, for example, the recent AT&T merger,
right,
where the Trump administration tried to stop, and the courts really slammed pretty hard, saying, look, there's no, and again, that's sort of the Trump administration tried, but the court saying, look, on balance of the evidence, we find that this is a good economic merger. It's good for consumers. I guess that's the thing. When companies try to make those really big multi-million, billion-dollar decisions, they need to be able to have some kind of sense of where's this going.
I hear what you're saying. I think in a way, this reminds me of some other discussions we've had in that if it's, in part, this is an economic. When it goes to the courts, it has to be a legal and economic thing. You're saying because we need those bright lines when we're talking about litigation. But so then you can make the argument then if we want to effectively control monopolies for other reasons, for political reasons, the place to do it isn't through antitrust regulation, but rather through Congress passing laws.
Yeah, yes and no. Or if your concern is political power, then it's looking at campaign finance laws, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting.
Yeah, something like that. Or if it is just we want to discriminate against companies based on size, well, you could draw some size based parameters into a statute. Now, whether or not that's a good idea is something else.
But it's clearly a political question.
But again, it's a political decision.
Yeah.
And you're not calling on courts to make a decision. And that political decision, it can be right or wrong. And if it's wrong, it can be corrected.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing about, and this, again, you can see where this kind of ties back into so much of the stuff you and I talk about and agree about, is that a lot of these things, it's much better if they're worked out through Congress and not through the court system.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Anything else that stood out to you in the interview? I felt like, while he's obviously a person of the left, and so am I, but I felt like it didn't feel that partisan of a thing. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Okay.
Yeah. No, I thought he was very much kind of down the middle on things. And again, less. It wasn't a polemical sort of thing. If he's arguing a position, he's just saying, here's the history. Here's the facts. Here's what where we've been. Again, it's one of those where would we draw the line? I would be more of the less of a Keynesian, obviously, and the argument that he sort of kind of made, and I'll make it more so against Keynesianism, is that look, the idea is that Keynesianism increases the velocity of where money moving, and that's good for the economy. And I think the response to that, the Friedman response, is that yes, velocity matters, and I think everybody would agree that velocity matters. But it's who is best positioned to decide which direction that velocity is going, right?
Like the market, or
Exactly. So it's a matter of, look, if you think that it's a good thing that we need to inject money into the economy to boost things, there are two ways to do it. One would be let's have a big stimulus and the government will hand out money and decide where that money goes. Another way would be a big tax cut. And then those people who get the money can make up their own mind what's the best use of that money. And I think the Friedrich position, or Friedman position, and my position would be that you're better off having that wisdom of crowds kind of thing, where everybody gets to make the decision about the best bet on their money, as opposed to government, as the phrase goes, picking winners and losers.
And sort of the more from the left response to that, I think, would be two things. Number one is that because people don't spend all of a tax cut.
Too stupid.
No, that people don't spend all of a tax cut, so you have to cut more for the same size stimulus as opposed to direct spending. And number two, stimulus, you can just inject that and then it's done, but a tax cut isn't exactly forever, but once it's put into place, it's kind of hard to take away when the need for it is ended. So you can kind of inject the stimulus.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a fair argument. Is that tax cuts that don't sunset are different from a stimulus, but that goes more to the idea that again that I would support of the starve the beast kind of thing.
Absolutely,
except it has, as he pointed out quite correctly, it hasn't seemed to have worked so far.
No.
It's just we get a bigger, more in debt beast. So no, I think it was fantastic, and that's the kind of thing I love that we do. That is sort of a mini economics course, right? Because again, it's one of those I know enough about economics just to be dangerous, and you know what I mean. It's a lot like, I mean, I can, if you ask me to, I could explain Einstein's theory, general theory of relativity, in sort of broad outlines about how it works. But I certainly can't do the math.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting to hear from the the real people who do the real science on this.
Yeah, absolutely.
To get sort of a second layer of depth that I think informs the rest of our discussions on this. So I'm interested in reading the book. Hopefully I can get around to that. So
it's one of the best nonfiction books I've read all year, really. And so in doing it, it really did help I love that kind of historical perspective stuff as well. And so it was a lot of fun to talk to him, and I'm glad you enjoyed the interview too.
Yeah, one more thing that I wanted to point out, because again, I haven't read the book. This is one of the reasons I really like to, but I think that he highlights that so often, and this is part of the uncertainty that we have in economics, is like so much of this seemed kind of, he had these great anecdotes about these various people who were involved in various decisions and sort of the persona of Milton Friedman. But how sometimes these are like weird, quirky, personal things that drive this. And I'm also sort of fascinated by that idea that sometimes there's also this, things fall in and out of fashion.
Yeah.
Right. And it's their personal weird decisions that may or may not be rational.
No, it's a great, And
I think the same thing you could say, like, because I like the history of, like hard science. There's also that weird sort of thing of there were times when different theories, on whether string theory was in fashion, now less so. I mean, Einstein didn't like quantum mechanics because it just didn't see, there was that kind of thing that it's not scientific, it's personality kind of driven, or it's rivalry driven. And I think that can't be discounted when we talk about our intellectual history.
Yeah, no, that's
on any subject. But I think that was great that he had those kind of anecdotes in there, and because that's what it is, just, at the end of the day, a bunch of people trying to figure stuff out.
Yeah. And there was so much that I didn't have a chance to ask him because we had limited time. But one of the things that kind of goes along with this is just the incredibly important role that one institution played in all of this. And all these people that he talks about were connected through the University of Chicago's economics department. And it's just amazing to me to think how this one school in this one city, this one department in this one city had just this massive influence on the course of 20th and early 21st century economics. It kind of blew my mind, really. And for people who aren't familiar with the Chicago School of Economics, this would be a great introduction to that, because it's truly amazing, all these connections that all go through the University of Chicago.
Yeah. I think I was lost. Oh, can I throw one more thing?
Yeah,
because
please
again,
do.
I really liked it. I didn't want to, but I thought it was fascinating the distinction he made, because this is something I had never really thought about. But then it's one of those. That's when you can tell, like, when you're dealing with like really smart, genius kind of people, is they'll say something that you're like, oh, I've never really thought about that, but now that I look at it, it's like so damn obvious. Of course, is that the difference between economic regulation and then other health, safety, environmental regulations, the difference that we moved from in the beginning in the late 60s, from the straight out price wage control type economy to the next level of regulations, and how those types of regulations, it's two different animals.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I'd agree with them. The first one is more pernicious than the first, rather than the second, right?
Yeah.
The straight out wage and price. So but again, I'd never really thought about that distinction between the two types and how that changed in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I thought that was a great point too. All right, well, Jay, I appreciate you taking the time to listen to the interview and talk with me about it. Like I said, I find that these post-interview conversations, I've enjoyed all of them that we've done so far. I really think they bring something useful, and listeners, we hope that you enjoy them as well. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support is what keeps the show going, and we truly appreciate it. When you become a monthly sustaining supporter of the show on Patreon, you don't just get our gratitude, you get a supporters exclusive bonus episode each and every week. Also, supporters at various levels can get additional bonuses like Politics Guys gear and access to a special supporters only Facebook group. To learn more about all this stuff, go to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can visit our website, politicsguys.com/support. Subscribing to the show also really helps, as does sharing episodes. Word of mouth is, of course, the best advertising, and we really would appreciate it if you tell folks about the show. Leaving reviews and ratings on whatever podcast app you use is also greatly appreciated. If you want to get in touch with us, you can do that at mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us, and we're posting things throughout the week. It's facebook.com/politicsguys page. Finally, we're on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Benji Fishman, and Andra Masker. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.